when the hero learns that his new bride, Eurydice, has been claimed by the underworld. In a heartfelt arioso, 2 Morta, Orfeo laments his loss and vows to enter Hades to reclaim his beloved. Listen especially to the poignant conclusion in which Orfeo, by means of an ascending vocal line, bids farewell to earth, sky, and sun, and thus begins his journey to the land of the dead. Having descended to the shores of Hades, Orfeo now invokes all his musical powers to gain entry. In the aria, Pos and Sperto, he addresses Charon, the spirit that controls access to the kingdom of the dead. Orfeo's elaborate, florid vocal style, aided by an exotic instrumental accompaniment, soon disarms the frightful guard. After stanza 2, for example, we hear the cornetto, the now extinct wind instrument of the Renaissance and Baroque that sounded something akin to a cross between a trumpet and a clarinet. In the original Greek myth, Pluto, the lord of Hades, releases Eurydice to Orfeo with one condition: he is to have faith that she is following behind him, and he must not look back before reaching Earth's surface. When Orfeo yields to the temptation to look back and embrace Eurydice, she is reclaimed by Pluto forevermore. In his opera Orfeo, Monteverdi altered this tragic conclusion. Apollo intervenes, transforming his son Orfeo into a constellation that radiates eternal spiritual harmony with the beloved Eurydice. In so doing, Monteverdi established what was to become a convention for 17th and 18th century opera, the lieto fine, or happy ending. Chamber cantata. 17th and 18th century Venice had much in common with modern Las Vegas. It was a tourist destination where gambling and prostitution flourished, and because the citizens were accustomed to wearing masks, what happened in Venice stayed in Venice. In 1613, Claudio Monteverdi moved to this very worldly city in the sea to become director of music at the Basilica of St. Mark, then perhaps the most prestigious musical position in the world. But Monteverdi not only wrote religious music there, he also composed opera and a new genre, the chamber cantata. Whereas opera was the dominant form of public theater music during the Baroque period, the cantata became the primary genre of vocal chamber music. The word cantata literally means something sung, as opposed to sonata, something sounded. Because it was usually performed before a select group of listeners in a private residence, this genre is called the chamber cantata. Like opera, the 17th century chamber cantata emphasized accompanied solo singing, and the subject matter usually concerned unrequited love or the heroes and heroines of ancient history and mythology. A typical chamber cantata lasts 8 to 15 minutes and is usually divided into contrasting sections that alternate between recitative and aria. Although it lacks costumes and scenery, a chamber cantata might be considered a mini-opera, but for a single soloist. The most prolific composer of chamber cantatas in the early Baroque was the Venetian Barbara Strozzi. Barbara Strozzi was steeped in the traditions of Claudio Monteverdi. Her teacher, Francesco Cavalli, was a pupil of Monteverdi, and her father, Giulio Strozzi, wrote librettos for him. The younger Strozzi excelled in composing chamber cantatas, works for solo voice and basso continuo that she herself could sing in the fashionable homes of Venice's elite. Her cantata Lamento Segreto treats the eternal subject of unrequited love. The hopeless lover is too timid to reveal her passion to the object of her desire, preferring to plead for a merciful death. The petition for death, Voglio morire, comes in the form of a brief aria accompanied by a basso continuo. The bass line of the basso continuo sounds a stepwise descent that repeats again and again. Example 11.3. Barbara Strozzi, professional composer. Until the 20th century, very few women earned a living as professional composers. In the Middle Ages, for example, a few trouberists wrote chansons, but to a woman, they were all members of the lesser nobility and not financially dependent on the success of their creations. So, too, a few women composed during the late Renaissance and early Baroque, but most were cloistered nuns who received their sustenance from the church. The reason for the scarcity of independent women composers in the Baroque era is simple: only performance within the home was then thought to be an appropriate musical activity for ladies. Musical activities outside the home were not deemed proper because they smacked of professionalism. Women did not go to university, nor did they engage in income-earning professions or trades. There were, however, a few notable exceptions. Adriana Basile, an associate of Monteverdi at Mantua, carved out for herself a highly successful career as a virtuoso soprano, thereby laying claim to the title, the first diva. In 1678, Elena Piscopia became the first woman to receive a university degree, when she earned the title Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Padua, Italy, following a rigorous public examination carried out in Latin. We have seen the work of Artemisia Gentileschi, a Florentine painter who became the first woman to be admitted to the prestigious Accademia del Disegno and who went on to become a court painter for King Charles I of England. And to this list of illustrious women artists and intellectuals should be added the name of Barbara Strozzi. A portrait of Barbara Strozzi painted in the 1630s by Bernardo Strozzi, perhaps a relative. Copyright Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Barbara Strozzi was born out of wedlock in 1619, the daughter of a Venetian man of letters, Giulio Strozzi, who encouraged her musical development. Giulio Strozzi not only provided his daughter with lessons in composition but also organized domestic gatherings where her works could be heard. When Giulio Strozzi died in 1652, Barbara was left both destitute and desperate. She had 4 children but was unmarried. Over the next 6 years, she published 6 collections of cantatas, more than any other composer of the early Baroque. Each collection was dedicated to a member of the high nobility, and according to custom, the dedicatee paid for the honor. Barbara Strozzi may have been unique as a professional woman composer, but she had to deal with economic reality just like her male counterparts. Throughout the Baroque era, composers earned handsome sums from dedicatory fees paid by wealthy patrons, but nothing from royalties generated by sales of the music itself. Payment of royalties, to both male and female composers, would not come until the 20th century. A melody, harmony, or rhythm that repeats continually throughout a musical composition is an ostinato. When the repetition occurs in the bass, it is called a basso ostinato. The term ostinato comes from an Italian word meaning obstinate, stubborn, or pig-headed. In Baroque operas and cantatas, performers often sang laments accompanied by a basso ostinato that descended, as here, in stepwise motion. Such a descending bass consequently became a symbol for grief or lamentation. Consider the title of Barbara Strozzi's aria, "Could any sentiment be more lamentable than, I want to die?" Listening Exercise 16. Strozzi. Voglio morire. 118. 17. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Most early Baroque vocal music consists of arias and recitatives accompanied by a basso continuo and, in some cases, other instruments as well. In this recording of the aria, Voglio morire, which begins Barbara Strozzi's cantata Lamenti Segreto, the continuo is played by a cello, harpsichord, and guitar. The cello plays the short bass line again and again, thereby forming a basso ostinato. The harpsichord and guitar fill out the texture, offering chordal support above this bass. The simplicity of this example allows both basso continuo and basso ostinato to be heard with unusual clarity. 1. The basso ostinato takes about 5 seconds to play. How many notes are there in the pattern? A, 2B, 4C, 6. 2. How many chords are there in the pattern? A, 2B, 4C, 6. 3. At the beginning of the aria, the basso continuo sounds alone. How many presentations of the pattern occur before the voice enters? A, 3B, 5C, 7. 4. Now the voice enters and the pattern continues. How many times is the pattern heard? A, 3B, 5C, 7. 5. In this passage, the basso ostinato suddenly changes, 1 or more notes are added to the bass pattern. Now how many notes are in the pattern? A, 3B, 5C, 7. 6. From here to the end of the aria, does the bass pattern ever change? A, yes, B, no. 7. The rate of harmonic change in this aria is which? A, regular, B, irregular. Now we focus on issues other than the basso continuo and the basso ostinato. 8. Which of the 3 continuo instruments improvises elaborate decorations? A, guitar, B, cello, C, harpsichord. 9. An aria, as opposed to recitative, is usually characterized by luxuriant singing in which the voice occasionally breaks out into a melisma. In this aria, when do the melliesmes occur? A, toward the beginning, B, toward the end. 10. In many arias, the singer is accompanied by instruments in addition to the basso continuo, most often the violins. Do violins accompany the voice in this aria? A, yes, B, no. Opera in London. Opera originated in Italy during the early 17th century. From there it spread over the Alps to German-speaking countries, to France, and eventually to England. But owing to the strong tradition of theatre in England, epitomized by productions of Shakespeare's plays, the English had a love-hate affair with opera. Sometimes they wanted to hear it, and sometimes they did not. The first important opera written in English, Henry Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, dates from 1689. Chronologically, it falls outside the boundaries of the early Baroque. But because English opera at this time was heavily influenced by earlier Italian opera, Purcell's opera belongs stylistically to the earlier period. Figure 11.6. Henry Purcell, by an anonymous painter. Copyright Bildarchiv Preußischer Kulturbesitz Art Resource, New York. Henry Purcell. Henry Purcell has been called the greatest of all English composers. Indeed, only the late Baroque composer George Frideric Handel and pop songwriters John Lennon and Paul McCartney can plausibly challenge Purcell for this title. Purcell was born in London, the son of one of the king's singers. In 1679, the younger Purcell obtained the position of organist at Westminster Abbey, and then, in 1682, he became organist for the King's Chapel Royal as well. But London has always been a vital theatre town, and although an employee of the court, Purcell increasingly devoted his attention to works for the public stage. Purcell's Dido and Aeneas was among the first operas written in the English language. Yet it was apparently created for neither the King's Court nor a public theatre, but for a private girls' boarding school in the London suburb of Chelsea. The girls presented one major stage production annually, something like the senior class play of today. In Dido and Aeneas, they sang the numerous choruses and danced in the equally frequent dance numbers. All 9 solo parts save one were written for female voices. The libretto of the opera, one appropriate for a school curriculum steeped in classical Latin, is drawn from Virgil's Aeneid. Surely the girls had studied this epic poem in Latin class, and likely they had memorized parts of it. Surely, too, they knew the story of the soldier of fortune Aeneas, who seduces proud Dido, queen of Carthage, but then deserts her to fulfill his destiny, sailing on to found the city of Rome. Betrayed and alone, Dido vents her feelings in an exceptionally beautiful aria, When I Am Laid in Earth, and then expires. In Virgil's original story, Dido stabs herself with the sword of Aeneas. Here in Purcell's opera, she dies of a broken heart, her pain is poison enough. Figure 11.7. A detail from the painting The Death of Dido by Guercino. The servant Belinda bends over the dying Dido, who has fallen on her formidable sword. Copyright Scala Art Resource, New York. Dido's final aria is introduced by a brief example of simple recitative, Thy hand, Belinda. Normally, simple recitative is a businesslike process that moves the action along through direct declamation. In this passage, however, recitative transcends its typically perfunctory role. Notice the remarkable way Purcell sets the English language. He understood where the accents fell in the text of his libretto, and he knew how to replicate these effectively in music. In example 11-4, the stressed words in the text generally appear in long notes and at the beginning of each measure. Equally important, notice how the vocal line descends a full octave, passing through chromatic notes along the way. As the voice twists chromatically downward, we feel the pain of the abandoned Dido. By the end, she has slumped into the arms of her servant Belinda. Example 11-4. From the recitative, Thy hand, Belinda, Purcell moves imperceptibly to the climactic aria, When I Am Laid in Earth, where Dido sings of her impending death. Because this high point of the opera is a lament, Purcell chooses, in the Baroque tradition, to build it upon a basso ostinato. English composers called the basso ostinato the ground bass, because the repeating bass provided a solid foundation, or grounding, on which an entire composition could be built. The ground bass Purcell composed for Dido's lament consists of 2 sections. A chromatic stepwise descent over the interval of a fourth and a 2-measure cadence returning to the tonic G. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 14, Ostinato Form in the Music of Purcell, Pachelbel, Elton John, and Vitamin C, at the text website. In the libretto, Dido's lament consists of a brief one-stanza poem with an ABA rhyme scheme. When I am laid in earth, may my wrongs create no trouble in thy breast. Remember me, but forget my fate. Each line of text is repeated, as are many individual words and pairs of words alike. In this case, Dido's repetitions are perfectly appropriate to her emotional state. She can communicate in fragments, but cannot articulate her feelings in complete sentences. Here the listener cares less about grammatical correctness, however, and more about the emotion of the moment. No fewer than 6 times does Dido plead with Belinda, and with us, to remember her. And, indeed, we do remember, for this plaintive aria is one of the most moving pieces in all of opera. Listening exercise 17. Purcell. When I am laid in earth. 1:19:20. 1:8:9. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Henry Purcell begins the climactic scene of Dido and Aeneas with an expressive recitative and follows it with a lamenting aria built on a basso ostinato. To avoid a fitful start and stop melody, which the short, repeating bass would seem to dictate, Purcell composes melodic phrases that span more than one statement of the bass pattern. In this suicide aria, emotion carries the voice beyond the constraining form inscribed in the bass. 1. Is the recitative a simple recitative or an accompanied recitative? A. Simple. B. Accompanied. 2. What is the trajectory of the voice in this recitative? A. It ascends to reflect Dido's exalted mood. B. It descends to reflect the depressed spirit of Dido. 3. How many statements of the basso ostinato sound before the voice enters? A. 1B, 2C, 3. 4. When the voice enters, does the rest of the orchestra enter then as well? A. Yes. B. No. 5. How many times does the voice sing the lines, "When I am laid in earth, may my wrongs create no trouble in thy breast"? A. Once. B. Twice. C. 3 times. 6. During this same passage, how many statements of the basso ostinato are performed? A. 1B, 2C, 3D, 4. 7. How many times does the voice sing the musical phrase "Remember me, but ah, forget my fate," and how many statements of the basso ostinato accompany it? A. Once, 1C, 3 times, 3B, twice, 2D, twice, 4. 8. The emotional high point in this aria comes when the singer reaches her highest notes and loudest dynamic. When does this occur? A. At the first statement of "Remember me." B. At the second statement of "Remember me." 9. Which of the following, as appropriate for a lament, is true of this aria? A. It is in a major key and a fast tempo. B. It is in a major key and a slow tempo. C. It is in a minor key and a fast tempo. D. It is in a minor key and a slow tempo. 10. Dido singing a lament over a ground bass has much in common with which popular song over a repeating bass? A. Rihanna singing "Don't Stop the Music." B. Elton John singing "Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word." C. Louis Armstrong's rendition of the tune "Willie the Weeper." Elton John and basso ostinato. For an up-to-date example of ostinato bass, we can look at a modern aria lament by a more recent English composer, Elton John. Although not built exclusively on an ostinato figure, John's song, "Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word," nonetheless has one striking affinity to the aria by Purcell. It, too, makes use of a basso ostinato, incorporating a chromatically descending fourth as a way of setting a very, very sad text. The ostinato pattern begins on G, with a chromatically descending fourth followed by a one-measure cadence. This basso ostinato, and a slightly varied form of it, is then repeated several times for this and other lines of text. Elton John was the pop artist who studied at the Royal Academy of Music in London, inspired by the famous aria of his equally well-coiffed countryman. DMI Time Life Pictures Getty Images. Listen to Elton John, "Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word," in the iTunes and Rhapsody playlists at the text website. Compare Elton John's bass line with Purcell's basso ostinato, and note that both laments are set in the key of G minor. Key words: opera libretto monody recitative simple recitative aria arioso toccata chamber music cantata ostinato basso ostinato ground bass. 12 Toward late Baroque instrumental music. When we think of classical music today, we usually think of instrumental music and instrumental performing groups, a symphony orchestra or a string quartet, for example. The equation classical equals instrumental, while certainly not entirely true, nonetheless has some validity. about 80% of the Western classical repertoire is instrumental. The 17th century was the period in which instrumental music came to rival, and indeed surpass, vocal music in popularity, and statistics prove the point. During the Renaissance, the number of prints of vocal music outsold those of instrumental music by almost 10 to 1. By the end of the 17th century, on the other hand, instrumental publications outnumbered vocal ones by about 3 to 1. Much of this newfound desire for instrumental music can be attributed directly to the growing popularity of the violin and other instruments of the violin family. While the violin originated around 1520 as an instrument played solely by professionals, by 1650, it had become a favorite of talented amateurs. Composers such as Corelli, Vivaldi, and Bach responded to the growing demand for music for the violin and other string instruments by writing sonatas and concertos for them. Accompanying the growth of instrumental music was the emergence of a distinctly instrumental sound. During the Renaissance, melody was all of one generic type, a direct, uncomplicated line that could be performed by either a voice or an instrument. Around 1600, however, instrumental and vocal styles began to diverge. Composers increasingly became aware that the Baroque trumpet, for example, could easily leap an octave but could not run quickly up a scale and stay in tune. Accordingly, they began to write idiomatic music not only for voice but also for instruments, so as to take advantage of their special abilities and colors. Idiomatic writing, then, exploits the strengths and avoids the weaknesses of particular voices and instruments. Finally, during the Baroque era, the vocabulary of expressive gestures that had developed for vocal music came to be applied to instrumental music as well. Composers realized that the doctrine of affections was valid for instrumental music, too. By adopting devices used in vocal music, composers made it possible for purely instrumental music to express rage, despair, or a bright spring day. Even without the benefit of a text, instrumental music could tell a tale or paint a scene. As we shall see, it was by means of such expressive devices that Antonio Vivaldi was able to depict the 4 seasons of the year. The Baroque orchestra. The symphony orchestra as we know it today had its origins in 17th century Italy and France. At first, the term orchestra referred to the area for musicians in the ancient Greek theater, between the audience and the stage. Eventually, it came to mean the musicians themselves. At the beginning of the 17th century, the orchestra was something of a musical Noah's Ark. It included an impressive variety of instruments, but usually no more than 1 or 2 of each type. The small orchestra that accompanied Monteverdi's Orfeo, for example, consisted of 14 different instruments. By the mid-17th century, however, many of the older instruments from the late Renaissance, viol, sackbut, cornetto, shawm, and theorbo, had begun to disappear. Into their place stepped the 4 instruments of the violin family, violins, violas, cellos, and the related double bass. The violin family formed a core string ensemble, one that would henceforth dominate the orchestra. To this string nucleus were added woodwinds, first flute and oboes, and then bassoons, usually in pairs. Occasionally, a pair of trumpets would be included to provide extra brilliance. When trumpets appeared, so, too, often did timpani, although the parts for these drums were usually not written out but simply improvised as the music seemed to require. Finally, by the end of the 17th century, a pair of French horns was sometimes added to the orchestra to give it more sonic resonance. Supporting the entire ensemble was the ever-present basso continuo, one usually consisting of a harpsichord to provide chords and 1 or 2 low-string instruments to play the bass line. The orchestra for Western classical music, then, can be said to be an ensemble of musicians, organized around a core of strings, with added woodwinds and brasses, playing under a leader. Most Baroque orchestras were small, usually with no more than 20 performers, and none of the parts was doubled, that is, no more than 1 instrumentalist was assigned to a single written line. Yet while the typical Baroque orchestra had no more than 20 players, there were exceptions, especially toward the end of the 17th century. At some of the more splendid courts around Europe, the orchestra might swell to as many as 80 instrumentalists for special occasions. Foremost among these was the court of French King Louis XIV. Of all the courts of Baroque Europe, that of King Louis XIV was the most splendid. Louis styled himself the Sun King, after Apollo, the god of the sun and of music. Outside of Paris, near the small town of Versailles, Louis built himself a palace, the largest court complex ever constructed. There Louis not only shone forth in all his glory but also ruled absolutely, as he famously said, I am the state. Figure 12.1. Detail of an orchestra playing for a Baroque opera, as seen in Pietro Domenico Olivero's interior of the Teatro Regio, Turin. From left to right are a bassoon, 2 French horns, a cello, a double bass, a harpsichord, and then violins, violas, and oboes. Scala Art Resource, New York. To direct music at the court, Louis XIV engaged another domineering figure, Jean-Baptiste Lully, who controlled the court orchestra. Lully built his orchestra around a nucleus of 24 string players. To these he added flutes, oboes, and bassoons. Lully was the first composer to require that strings and woodwinds always play together in an orchestra, though he often asked the woodwinds to do no more than double the notes of the strings. For his increasingly large orchestra, Lully selected the players, led rehearsals, and made sure they all executed the notes exactly and in strict time. If necessary, he instilled discipline by force. In one instance, he hit a violinist with his large conducting stick, and in another, he broke a violin over the owner's back. Ironically, Lully's penchant for musical discipline killed him. Late in 1686, while thumping the floor with his conducting stick, he stabbed himself in the foot and died of gangrene a few weeks later. Figure 12.2. This standard view of the front of Versailles gives a sense of the grandeur of the palace that King Louis XIV began there in 1669. The Gallery Collection Corbis. Besides setting in place the core of the modern orchestra, Jean-Baptiste Lully can claim credit for another innovation, the French overture. An overture is an instrumental piece that precedes and thus opens some larger composition, such as an opera, oratorio, ballet, or suite of dances. As perfected by Lully, the distinctly French overture consists of 2 sections. The first is set in a slow duple meter, with stately dotted rhythms suggesting a royal procession. The second is in a fast triple meter and features much imitation among the various musical lines. Although developed at the court of Louis XIV, the French overture spread to England and Germany. Handel wrote one, for example, to begin his Messiah, and Bach did likewise to open each of his orchestral suites. Pachelbel and his canon. Today most of us remember the name Johann Pachelbel only because of a single musical composition, the famous Pachelbel Canon, in D major. In his day, however, Pachelbel was known as a composer of a great deal of instrumental music, some of it for small orchestra but most for organ or harpsichord. Pachelbel's canon is the first movement of a 2-movement instrumental suite, the second being a lively contrapuntal dance called a jague. The odd thing about Pachelbel's canon is that we don't even hear the imitative canon, or at least we don't focus on it. The 3 canonic voices are all in the same range and all played by a violin. Because the lines don't stand out from one another by range or color, the unfolding of the canon is difficult to follow. What we hear instead is the bass line churning inexorably in the low strings, which, together with the harpsichord, form the basso continuo. A strong bass is typical of Baroque music generally, but Pachelbel's bass is unforgettable in part because it has a pleasing intervallic pattern to it and because it gravitates strongly around the subdominant, dominant, and tonic chords. Pachelbel knew he was onto a good thing, so he gives us this bass line 28 times, a classic example of a basso ostinato. The allure of the bass is such that later classical composers borrowed it, as well as pop musicians in recent times, such as Blues Traveler, Vitamin C, and Coolio. The full composition has served as background music in numerous TV commercials and films. Why such popularity? Likely the reason is a play of opposites that we find appealing. The regular, almost plodding bass provides a rock-solid foundation for the free flights of fancy that unfold in the soaring violins. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 14, Ostinato Form in the Music of Purcell, Pachelbel, Elton John, and Vitamin C, at the text website. Example 12.1. During the 1680s, about the time he composed his canon, Pachelbel worked in central Germany where, among other things, he became the teacher of Johann Christoph Bach, the older brother and only known teacher of Johann Sebastian Bach. Pachelbel's use of counterpoint here is suggestive of a return to favor of polyphony and contrapuntal texture in instrumental music generally at the end of the 17th century. The greatest proponent of late Baroque instrumental counterpoint, as we shall see in the next chapter, would be J.S. Bach himself. Corelli and the Trio Sonata. The melody of Pachelbel's canon is carried by 3 violins. As the Baroque era progressed, the popularity of the violin continued to grow, and so, too, did the demand for string music that talented amateurs might play in the home. This demand, in turn, encouraged the growth of a new genre of instrumental music, the sonata. A sonata is a type of instrumental chamber music. When the term sonata originated in early 16th century Italy, it connoted something sounded, in distinction to a cantata, which meant something sung. A Baroque sonata consists of a collection of movements, each with its own mood and tempo, but all in the same key. In the Baroque era, the movements usually carried such names as allemande, sarabande, gavotte, or jague, all named after dances. A Baroque sonata with dance movements was normally called a chamber sonata and consisted of 4 movements with alternating tempos, slow fast slow fast. In the Baroque era, there were 2 types of sonatas, the solo sonata and the trio sonata. A solo sonata might be written either for a solo keyboard instrument, such as the harpsichord, or for a solo melody instrument, such as the violin, in which case 3 musicians were actually needed, the violinist and the 2 basso continuo performers. A trio sonata consists of 3 musical lines. Yet here, too, the term is somewhat misleading, for when a harpsichord joins with the bass to form the basso continuo, 4 players actually perform. The sonata originated in Italy and then spread to the rest of Europe, in large measure through the published works of Arcangelo Corelli. Figure 12.3. Arcangelo Corelli looks placid enough in this print. But when playing the violin, according to a contemporary, his eyes turn red as fire, his face becomes distorted, and his eyeballs roll as if in agony. Lebrecht Colorizer A.L. Arcangelo Corelli. The composer virtuoso who made the Baroque solo and trio sonatas internationally popular was Arcangelo Corelli. Corelli was born in 1653 near Bologna, Italy, then an important center for violin instruction and performance. By 1675, he had moved to Rome, where he remained for the duration of his life as a teacher, composer, and performer on the violin. Corelli was one of the first superstars of the violin, and he remains today the only musician buried in Rome's Pantheon, as its name implies, a hall for the gods. Of Italian culture. Although Corelli's musical output was small, consisting of only 5 sets of sonatas and 1 of concertos, his works were widely admired. Such diverse composers as Johann Sebastian Bach in Leipzig, François Couperin in Paris, and Henry Purcell in London either borrowed his melodies directly or more generally studied and absorbed his style. The most remarkable aspect of Corelli's music is its harmony. It sounds modern to our ears. We have heard so much classical and popular music that we have come to possess an almost subconscious sense of how a succession of chords, a harmonic progression, should sound. Corelli was the first composer to write this kind of harmony, one that we call functional harmony, in which each chord has a specific role, or function, in the overall succession of chords. Not only does the individual chord constitute an important sound in itself, but it also draws us toward the next, thereby helping to form a tightly linked chain of chords, which sounds directed and purposeful. The most basic link in the chain is the VI. Cadence. In addition, Corelli often constructs bass lines that move upward chromatically by half step. This chromatic, stepwise motion pulls up and into the next higher note, increasing the sense of direction and cohesiveness we feel in Corelli's music. Trio Sonata in C Major, Opus 4, No. 1. The Trio Sonata in C Major, Opus 4, No. 1, is a chamber sonata written by Corelli in 1694 for 2 violins and basso continuo, here played by a harpsichord and cello. Corelli called this sonata Opus 4, No. 1. This chamber sonata is in 4 movements, the second and fourth of which are dance movements in binary form, the most common musical form for Baroque dances. No one danced, however. These movements were stylized pieces that aimed only to capture in music the spirit of the dance in question. As one musician of the day observed, they are written for the refreshment of the ear alone. Corelli begins Sonata Opus 4, No. 1 with a preludio, which gives the players a chance to warm up and also establishes the general musical mood of the sonata. Notice that the prelude makes use of what is called a walking bass, a bass that moves at a moderate, steady pace, mostly in equal note values and often stepwise up or down the scale. Figure 12.4. The violin came to be the most important string instrument of the orchestra during the Baroque period. Up to that point it had been mainly a low-class instrument for playing dances in taverns. Compared to the earlier viol, the violin had only 4 strings, no frets, and a louder, more penetrating sound. The best of the Baroque violin makers was Antonio Stradivari, whose instruments today, as seen in this photo, have sold for as much as $4 million at auction. Copyright Victoria and Albert Museum, London. The Bridgeman Art Library International. Example 12.2. The second movement, a dance called the Correnti, is rather fast and in triple meter. Here the first violin engages in a rapid dialogue with the cello. The second violin is scarcely audible as it helps fill in the chords, literally playing second fiddle to the first violin. The short adagio serves merely as a bridge that links the Correnti with the final movement, the brisk, duple meter allemanda. This last movement, too, has a walking bass, but the tempo is so fast that it sounds more like a running or a sprinting bass. Vivaldi and the Baroque Concerto. The concerto was to the Baroque era what the symphony would later become to the classical period, the showpiece of orchestral music. A Baroque concerto emphasizes abrupt contrasts within a unity of mood, just as striking change between the zones of light and darkness often characterizes a Baroque painting. A concerto is a musical composition marked by a friendly contest or competition between a soloist and an orchestra. When only one soloist confronts the orchestra, the work is a solo concerto. When a small group of soloists works together, performing as a unit against the full orchestra, the piece is called a concerto grosso. A concerto grosso consists of 2 performing forces who work together, a larger group forming the basic orchestra called the concerto grosso and a smaller one of 2, 3, or 4 soloists called the concertino. Playing together, the 2 groups constitute the full orchestra, called the tutti. A typical concerto grosso had a concertino of 2 violins and continuo. The soloists were not highly paid masters imported from afar, but rather the regular first-chair players who, when they were not serving as soloists, joined with the others to form the tutti. The resulting contrast was desirable, said a contemporary, so that the ear might be astonished by the alternation of loud and soft, as the eye is dazzled by the alternation of light and shade. As written by Vivaldi and Bach, the solo concerto and the concerto grosso usually had 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. The serious first movement is composed in a carefully worked-out structure called ritornello form. The second movement is invariably more lyrical and tender, while the third movement, though often using ritornello form, tends to be lighter, more dance-like, sometimes even rustic in mood. Both the solo concerto and the concerto grosso originated in Italy toward the end of the 17th century. Solo concertos for violin, flute, recorder, oboe, trumpet, and harpsichord were especially popular. The vogue of the concerto grosso peaked about 1730 and then all but ended around the time of Bach's death. But the solo concerto continued to be cultivated during the classical and romantic periods, becoming increasingly a showcase in which a single soloist could display his or her technical mastery of an instrument. Antonio Vivaldi. No composer was more influential, and certainly none more prolific, in the creation of the Baroque concerto than Antonio Vivaldi. Vivaldi, like Barbara Strozzi, a native of Venice, was the son of a barber and part-time musician at the Basilica of St. Mark. Young Vivaldi's proximity to St. Mark's naturally brought him into contact with the clergy. Although he became a skilled performer on the violin, he also entered holy orders, ultimately being ordained a priest. Vivaldi's life, however, was by no means confined to the realm of the spirit. He concertized on the violin throughout Europe. He wrote and produced nearly 50 operas, which brought him a great deal of money, and he lived for 15 years with an Italian opera star. The worldly pursuits of Il Prete Rosso eventually provoked a response from the authorities of the Roman Catholic Church. In 1737, Vivaldi was forbidden to practice his musical artistry in papally controlled lands. This benefited his income as well as his creativity. He died poor and obscure in 1741 in Vienna, where he had gone in search of a post at the imperial court. Figure 12.5. Portrait of a violinist and composer believed by some to be the musician Antonio Vivaldi. Copyright Alinari, the Bridgeman Art Library International. From 1703 until 1740, Vivaldi worked in Venice at the Ospedale della Pietà, first as a violinist and music teacher, and then as musical director. The Hospice of Mercy was an orphanage for the care and education of young women. It was one of 4 such charitable institutions in Venice that accepted abandoned, mostly illegitimate girls, who, as several reports state, otherwise would have been thrown in the canals. By 1700, music had been made to serve an important role in the religious and social life of the orphanage. Each Sunday afternoon, its orchestra of young women offered public performances for the well-to-do of Venice. Also attending these concerts were foreign visitors. Venice was already a tourist city, among them a French diplomat, who wrote in 1739. Figure 12:6. Foreign visitors attend a concert performed by orphan girls assembled from various orphanages around Venice, as depicted by Gabriele Bella about 1750. The Hospice of Mercy was the most musically intense of the Venetian orphanages. Here girls who showed a special talent for music were placed within a prestigious ensemble of 40 musicians. Their musical education included tutelage in singing, ear training, and counterpoint, as well as instruction on at least 2 musical instruments. Antonio Vivaldi was one of the teachers. Copyright Scala Art Resource, New York. These girls are educated at the expense of the state, and they are trained solely with the purpose of excelling in music. That is why they sing like angels and play violin, flute, organ, oboe, cello, and bassoon. In short, no instrument is so big as to frighten them. They are kept like nuns in a convent. All they do is perform concerts, always in groups of about 40 girls. I swear to you that there is nothing as pleasant as seeing a young and pretty nun, dressed in white, with a little pomegranate bouquet over her ears, conducting the orchestra with all the gracefulness and incredible precision one can imagine. Violin Concerto in E Major, Opus 8, No. 1, The Spring. During the early 1700s, Vivaldi composed literally hundreds of solo concertos for the all-female orchestras of the Hospice of Mercy in Venice. In 1725, he gathered 12 of the more colorful of these together and published them under the title Opus 8. In addition, he called the first 4 of these solo concertos the seasons. What Vivaldi meant by this was that each of the 4 concertos in turn represents the feelings, sounds, and sights of one of the 4 seasons of the year, beginning with spring. So that there be no ambiguity as to what sensations and events the music depicts at any given moment, Vivaldi first composed a poem about each season. Then he placed each line of the poem at the appropriate point in the music where that particular event or feeling was to be expressed, even specifying at one point that the violins are to sound like barking dogs. In so doing, Vivaldi showed that not only voices, but instruments as well, could create a mood and sway the emotions. Vivaldi also fashioned here a landmark in what is called instrumental program music, music that plays out a story or a series of events or moods. It is fitting that the seasons begins with the bright, optimistic sounds of spring. In fact, the Spring Concerto for solo violin and small orchestra is Vivaldi's best-known work. The fast first movement of this 3-movement concerto is composed in ritornello form, a form that Vivaldi was the first to popularize. In ritornello form, all or part of the main theme, the ritornello, returns again and again, invariably played by the tutti, or full orchestra. Between the tutti statements of the ritornello, the soloist inserts fragments and extensions of this ritornello theme in virtuosic fashion. Much of the excitement of a Baroque concerto comes from the tension between the reaffirming ritornello played by the tutti and the fanciful flights of the soloist. The jaunty ritornello theme of the first movement of the Spring Concerto has 2 complementary parts, the second of which returns more often than the first. Between appearances of the ritornello, Vivaldi inserts the music that represents his feelings about spring. He creates the songbirds of May by asking the violin to play rapidly and staccato in a high register. Similarly, he depicts the sudden arrival of thunder and lightning by means of a tremolo and shooting scales, then returns to the cheerful song of the birds. Thereafter, in the slow second movement, a vision of a flower-strewn meadow is conveyed by an expansive, tender melody in the violin. Finally, during the fast finale, a sustained droning in the lower strings invokes the festive sounds of country bagpipes. The full text of Vivaldi's program for the first movement of the Spring Concerto is given in the listening guide. Vivaldi's Spring Concerto is marked by a stylistic trait that is often prominent in his music, melodic sequence. A melodic sequence is the repetition of a musical motive at successively higher or lower degrees of the scale. Example 12-3 shows a sequence from the middle of the first movement of this work. In this sequence, the motive is repeated twice, each time a step lower. Example 12-3. Although melodic sequence can be found in music from almost all periods, it is especially prevalent in the Baroque. It helps propel the music forward and create the energy we associate with Baroque style. However, because hearing the same melodic phrase time and again can become a tedious listening experience, Baroque composers usually follow the 3 strikes and you're out rule. The melodic unit appears, as in example 12 to 3, 3 times, but no more. Vivaldi composed more than 450 concertos and thus is known as the father of the concerto. Widely admired as both a performer and a composer in his day, within a few years of his death, he was largely forgotten, a victim of rapidly changing musical tastes. Not until the revival of Baroque music in the 1950s were his scores resurrected from obscure libraries and dusty archives. Now his music is loved for its freshness and vigor, its exuberance and daring. More than 200 professional recordings have been made of the seasons alone. So often is the Spring Concerto played that it has passed from the realm of art music into that of classical pops, a staple at Starbucks. A complete checklist of musical style for the early and middle Baroque can be found at the text website. Listening Exercise 18. Vivaldi. Spring Concerto. 125. 110. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. The opening movement of Vivaldi's Spring Concerto is a traditional favorite with listeners everywhere, in part because its musical gestures are clear and its ritornello form straightforward. 1. Vivaldi was a virtuoso on this instrument, which dominates the sound of this concerto. A. Harpsichord. B. Violin. C. Cello. D. Organ. 2. How would you describe the rhythmic pulse of this movement? A. Energetic and regularly repeating patterns. B. Languid with no clear sense of a downbeat. 3. Ritornello Part 1 is immediately repeated pianissimo, as is Ritornello Part 2. Abrupt shifts in dynamics, typical of the Baroque era, are called what? A. Terrain dynamics. B. Terrace dynamics. C. Terracotta dynamics. 4. Does the basso continuo play during this solo section? A. Yes. B. No. 5. Vivaldi has modulated to a new key and brings back Ritornello Part 2. Does it sound at a higher or lower pitch compared to its first appearance? A. Higher. B. Lower. 6. Is the pattern in this melodic sequence rising or falling? A. Rising. B. Falling. 7. When the ritornello returns, in what mode is it? A. Major. B. Minor. 8. During this passage and beyond, what does the cello do? A. It rises by step. B. It falls by step. C. It plays a pedal point. 9. Which of the following is true about the Spring Concerto? A. It has both a basso continuo and a basso ostinato. B. It has a basso continuo but no basso ostinato. C. It has a basso ostinato but no basso continuo. D. It has neither a basso ostinato nor a basso continuo. 10. Finally, how did Vivaldi communicate his program to his listeners? A. He wrote onomatopoeic music that mimicked in sound the words of his own poem. B. He had created a poem about spring, and a narrator read it as the music sounded. C. He held up cue cards as the music sounded. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale Courses and complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: idiomatic writing, orchestra, overture, French overture, sonata, chamber sonata, solo sonata, trio sonata, opus, walking bass, concerto, solo concerto, concerto grosso, concertino, tutti, ritornello form, melodic sequence. The late Baroque, Bach 13. The music of the late Baroque period, represented by the two great figures Johann Sebastian Bach and George Friedrich Handel, stands as a high-water mark in Western musical culture. Among the marvels of late Baroque music, we might also include the works of Antonio Vivaldi, treated in the previous chapter, because some of his most distinctive concertos, such as the Spring, were written around 1710. But late Baroque music, typified by the works of Bach and Handel, is usually characterized by great length and contrapuntal complexity. Generally, the most noteworthy compositions of Bach and Handel are large-scale works full of dramatic power, broad gestures, and, often, complex counterpoint. At the same time, they convey to the listener a sense of technical mastery that Bach and Handel could compose seemingly effortlessly in a variety of musical forms, techniques, and styles, building on the innovations of previous Baroque composers. Earlier Baroque composers had created many new musical genres, such as opera, chamber cantata, sonata, solo concerto, and concerto grosso. The late Baroque, by contrast, is not a period of musical innovation, but one of refinement. Bach and his contemporaries did not, in the main, invent new forms, styles, techniques, or genres, but rather gave greater weight, length, and polish to those established by their musical forebears. Arcangelo Corelli, for example, had introduced functional harmony in his sonatas, but Bach and Handel expanded Corelli's harmonic template to create much longer, and often more compelling, works of art. Bach and Handel approached the craft of composition with unbounded self-confidence. Their music has a sense of rightness, solidity, and maturity about it. Each time we choose to listen to one of their compositions, we offer further witness to their success in bringing 100 years of musical innovation to a glorious culmination. Aspects of late Baroque musical style. During the years 1710-1750, Bach, Handel, and their contemporaries continued to build upon the distinctive elements of musical style that appeared earlier in the Baroque era. Melody is governed by the principle of progressive development. An initial theme is set forth and then continually expanded, spun out over an ever-lengthening line. Melodies are typically long and asymmetrical, and often the notes are propelled forward by melodic sequence, as exemplified by this passage in the overture to Bach's first orchestral suite. Example 13:1. Rhythm in late Baroque music is also ruled by the principle of progressive development. A piece typically begins with one prominent rhythmic idea, and it or a complementary one continues uninterrupted to the very end of the movement, pushed along by a strong, clearly audible beat. Indeed, beat and meter are more easily recognized in late Baroque music than in the music of any other period. Thus, if an overture or concerto by Bach or Handel seems to chug along with irrepressible optimism and vitality, it is usually owing to a strong beat, a clearly articulated meter, and a continually recurring rhythmic pattern. Finally, the music of Bach and Handel is usually denser in texture than that of the early Baroque era. Recall that around 1600, composers of the early Baroque rebelled against what they perceived to be the excessively polyphonic style of Renaissance music, with its constant overlapping points of imitation. As a result, early Baroque music is not polyphonic, but rather homophonic, in texture. By the heyday of Bach and Handel around 1725, however, composers had returned to polyphonic writing, mainly to add richness to the middle range of what had been in the early Baroque a top-bottom, dominated texture. German composers of the late Baroque were particularly fond of counterpoint, perhaps owing to their traditional love of the organ, an instrument with several keyboards, thus well suited to playing multiple polyphonic lines at once. The gradual reintegration of counterpoint into the fabric of Baroque music culminates in the rigorously contrapuntal vocal and instrumental music of J.S. Bach. Figure 13:1. The only authentic portrait of Johann Sebastian Bach, painted by Elias Gottlob Hausmann in 1746. Bach holds in his hand a six-voice canon, or round, which he created to symbolize his skill as a musical craftsman. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Johann Sebastian Bach. In the creations of Johann Sebastian Bach, the music of the Baroque reaches its greatest glory. Bach was born into a musical dynasty, though one originally of common standing. For nearly 200 years, members of the Bach family served as musicians in small towns in Thuringia, a province in central Germany. Johann Sebastian was merely the most talented of the ubiquitous musical Bachs, though he himself had 4 sons who achieved international fame. Aside from some initial instruction from his brother Johann Christoph, Bach was largely self-taught. To learn his craft, he studied, copied, and arranged the compositions of Corelli, Vivaldi, Pachelbel, and even Palestrina. He also learned to play the organ, in part by emulating others, once traveling 200 miles each way on foot to hear a great performer. Bach's first position of importance was in the town of Weimar, Germany, where he served as organist to the court beginning in 1708. It was here that he wrote many of his finest works for organ. Soon Bach became the most renowned organ virtuoso in Germany, and his improvisations on that instrument became legendary. Figure 13:2. The organ presently in the choir loft of St. Thomas's Church, Leipzig. It was from this loft that Bach played and conducted. Photo Beck Photo Library. Of all instruments, the organ is the most suitable for playing polyphonic counterpoint. Most organs have at least two separate keyboards for the hands, in addition to one placed on the floor, which the performer plays with the feet. This gives the instrument the capacity to play several lines simultaneously. More important, each of these keyboards can be set to engage a different group of pipes, each with its own color, and thus the ear can more readily hear the individual musical lines. For these reasons, the organ is the instrument par excellence for playing fugues. Fugue. Bach was the master of counterpoint, the art of combining completely independent melodies in imaginative ways, and rich, complex counterpoint lies at the heart of the fugue. Fugue is a contrapuntal form and procedure that flourished during the late Baroque era. The word fugue itself comes from the Latin fuga, meaning flight. Within a fugue, one voice presents a theme and then flies away, as another voice enters with the same theme. The theme in a fugue is called the subject. At the outset, each voice presents the subject in turn, and this successive presentation is called the exposition of the fugue. As the voices enter, they do not imitate or pursue each other exactly. This would produce a canon or a round such as row, row, row your boat. Rather, passages of exact imitation are interrupted by sections of free writing in which the voices more or less go their own ways. These freer sections, where the subject is not heard in its entirety, are called episodes. Episodes and further presentations of the subject alternate throughout the remainder of the fugue. Download a supplementary listening guide for Bach, Toccata, and Fugue in D minor, at the text website. Fugues have been written for from 2 to as many as 32 voices, but the norm is 2 to 5. These may be actual human voices in a chorus or choir, or they may simply be lines or parts played by a group of instruments, or even by a solo instrument like the piano, organ, or guitar, which has the capacity to play several voices simultaneously. Thus, a formal definition of a fugue might be as follows: a composition for 2, 3, 4, or 5 parts played or sung by voices or instruments, which begins with a presentation of a subject in imitation in each part, continues with modulating passages of free counterpoint and further appearances of the subject, and ends with a strong affirmation of the tonic key. Fortunately, the fugue is easier to hear than to describe. The unfolding and recurrence of one subject makes it easy to follow. See a hilarious video on the building of a fugue in the style of Bach, upon a subject of Britney Spears, in the YouTube playlist on the text website. Organ Fugue in G minor. Bach has left us nearly 100 keyboard fugues, about a third of which are for organ. The organ was Bach's favorite instrument, and in his day, he was known more as a performer and improviser on it than as a composer. Bach's G minor organ fugue was composed rather early in his career, sometime between 1708 and 1717, when he was in Weimar. It is written for 4 voices, which we will refer to as soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and it begins with the subject appearing first in the soprano. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 13, Fugue, Bach, Bizet, and Bernstein, at the text website. Example 13, 2. As fugue subjects go, this is a rather long one, but it is typical of the way Baroque composers like to spin out their melodies. It sounds very solid in tonality because the subject is clearly constructed around the notes of the G minor triad, not only in the first measure but on the strong beats of the following measures as well. The subject also conveys a sense of gathering momentum. It starts moderately with quarter notes and then seems to gain speed as eighth notes and finally 16th notes are introduced. This, too, is typical of fugue subjects. After the soprano introduces the subject, it is then presented, in turn, by the alto, the tenor, and the bass. The voices need not appear in any particular order. Here Bach simply decided to have them enter in succession from top to bottom. Figure 13, 3. Fugue by Joseph Albers. Albers's design suggests the constructivist quality of the fugue, one full of repeating and reciprocal relationships. The black and white units seem to allude to subject and episode, respectively. 2007 The Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation Artists' Rights Society, New York Photo, Art Archive Kunstmuseum Basel Johnny Dagliordi. When each voice has presented the subject and joined the polyphonic complex, Bach's exposition is at an end. Now a short passage of free counterpoint follows, the first episode, which uses only bits and pieces of the subject. Then the subject returns, but in a highly unusual way. It begins in the tenor, but continues and ends in the soprano. Thereafter, Bach's G minor fugue unfolds in the usual alternation of episodes and statements of the subject. The episodes sound unsettled and convey a sense of movement, modulating from one key to another. The subject, on the other hand, doesn't modulate. It is in a key, here the tonic G minor, or the dominant D minor, or some other closely related major key. The tension between settled music and unsettled music creates the exciting, dynamic quality of the fugue. Finally, because Bach wrote many fugues for organ, they often make use of a device particularly well suited to the organ, the pedal point. A pedal point is a note, usually in the bass, that is sustained for a time while harmonies change around it. Such a sustaining tone in the bass derives its name, of course, from the fact that on the organ the note is sounded by a foot holding down a key on the pedal keyboard. After a pronounced pedal point and additional statements of the subject, Bach modulates back to the tonic key, G minor, for one final statement of the subject in the bass to end his fugue. Notice that, although this fugue is in a minor key, Bach puts the last chord in major. This is common in Baroque music, with composers preferring the brighter, more optimistic, sound of the major mode in the final chord. Given all its complexities and the fact that it is full of reciprocating, almost mathematical relationships, it is not surprising that the fugue has traditionally appealed to listeners with scientific interest. Fugues are music for the eye and mind, as much as for the ear and heart. Listening exercise 19. Bach. Organ fugue in G minor. 126. 111. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Bach's fugue in G minor is composed for 4 voices. In the exposition, the subject appears 4 times, once in each voice, and it returns 5 times thereafter. The first skill needed to enjoy a fugue is the ability to differentiate the subject from the episodes. To assure that you are hearing the presentations of the subject, questions 1 to 5 ask you to identify the moments at which the subject enters after the exposition. The remaining questions explore the complexities that typically reside within a fugue. 1. Statement 5 of the subject begins at what time? A. 124b. 142. 2. Statement 6 of the subject begins at what time? A. 152b. 2 o'clock. 3. Statement 7 of the subject begins at what time? A. 211b. 2:20. 4. Statement 8 of the subject begins at what time? A. 2:54b. 3:02. 5. Statement 9 of the subject begins at what time? A. 3:40b. 3:49. 6. During this passage, as the bass plays the end of the subject, what does the soprano execute against it? A. A pedal point. B. A descending melodic sequence. C. A trill. D. A long, rising scale. 7. During this passage, what does the bass play? A. A pedal point. B. A descending melodic sequence. C. A trill. D. A long, rising scale. 8. During this passage, what does the soprano play? A. A pedal point. B. A descending melodic sequence. C. A trill. D. A long, rising scale. 9. During this passage, what does the tenor play? A. A pedal point. B. A descending melodic sequence. C. A trill. D. A long, rising scale. 10. Bach intended this 4-voice fugue to be played by how many performers on the organ? A. 1b, 2c, 3d, 4. Bach's orchestral music. After 9 years as organist in Weimar, Bach, then a young man with a wife and 4 children, determined to improve his station in life. In 1717, he auditioned for the position of music director at the court of Cologne, Germany, and was awarded the post. When he returned to Weimar to collect his family and possessions, the Duke of Weimar, displeased that the composer had jumped ship, had Bach thrown in jail for a month. When freed from jail, Bach fled to Cologne, where he remained for 6 years. Download supplementary listening guides for Bach, Orchestral Suite No. 3, Air, Gavottes 1 and 2, and Jag, at the text website. At Cologne, Bach turned his attention from organ music for the church to instrumental music for the court. It was here that he wrote the bulk of his orchestral scores, including more than a dozen solo concertos. The Prince of Cologne had assembled something of an all-star orchestra, drawing many top players from the larger city of Berlin. He also ordered a large two-keyboard harpsichord from Berlin and sent Bach to fetch it. About this time, Bach began his well-tempered clavier for keyboard, and during these years, he completed 6 concertos of the concerto grosso type. This set has come to be called the Brandenburg Concertos. The Brandenburg Concertos. In 1721, still in Cologne, Bach began to look for yet another job in the politically more important city of Berlin, specifically, at the court of Margrave Christian Ludwig of Brandenburg. To impress the Margrave, Bach gathered together a half-dozen of his best concertos and sent them to his prospective employer. Although no job offer was forthcoming, Bach's autograph manuscript survives, and in it are 6 superb examples of the Concerto Grosso. The Concerto Grosso, as we have seen, is a 3-movement work involving a musical give-and-take between a full orchestra and a much smaller group of soloists, consisting usually of just 2 or 3 violins and continuo. In the first movement, the tutti normally plays a recurring musical theme, called the ritornello. The soloists in the concertino play along with the tutti, but when the ritornello stops, they go on to present their own musical material in a flashy, sometimes dazzling show of technical skill. Each of the 6 Brandenburg concertos calls for a different group of soloists in the concertino. Together, these works constitute an anthology of nearly all instrumental combinations known to the Baroque era. Figure 13.4. The autograph manuscript of the opening of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 5. Lebrecht Music and Arts. Bach's aim in the Brandenburg concertos was to show his ability to write challenging music for any and all instruments. A listener cannot fail to be impressed by the brilliant writing for the harpsichord in Concerto No. 5, for example. Here the full orchestra is pitted against a concertino consisting of solo violin, flute, and, most important, harpsichord. In principle, the tutti plays the ritornello, and the soloists play motives derived from it. In practice, however, the separation between tutti and concertino is not as distinct with Bach as it was in the earlier concertos of Vivaldi. In Bach's more refined treatment of ritornello form, the line between the large ensemble and the small group of soloists is less obvious. Notice here that Bach's ritornello possesses many characteristics of Baroque melody. It is idiomatic to the violin, it is lengthy and somewhat asymmetrical, and it possesses a driving rhythm that propels the music forward. Download a supplementary listening guide for Bach, Brandenburg Concerto No. 2, first movement, at the text website. While the sound of violins dominates the ritornello in this opening movement, gradually the solo harpsichord steals the show. In fact, this work might fairly be called the first keyboard concerto. In earlier concertos, the harpsichord had appeared only as part of the basso continuo, not as a solo instrument. But here, toward the end of the movement, all the other instruments fall silent, leaving the harpsichord to sound alone in a lengthy section full of brilliant scales and arpeggios. Such a showy passage for soloist alone toward the end of a movement in a concerto is called a cadenza. One can easily imagine the great virtuoso Bach performing Brandenburg Concerto No. 5 in the Hall of Mirrors at Cologne, the principal concert hall of the court. There, seated at the large harpsichord he had brought from Berlin, Bach would have dazzled patron and fellow performers alike with his bravura playing. See a video of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 5, first movement, in the YouTube playlist on the text website. Finally, note the length of this movement, more than 9 minutes. Typical of Bach's grand musical vision, his movement is 3 times longer than a typical concerto movement by Vivaldi. Figure 13.5. The Hall of Mirrors at the court of Cologne, Germany, in which most of Bach's orchestral music was performed while he resided in that town. The bust on the pedestal at the right is of Bach. Copyright Craig Wright. The fingers of the harpsichordist get a much-deserved rest in the slow second movement of Brandenburg Concerto No. 5. Now an elegiac mood envelopes the music as the violin and flute engage in a quiet dialogue. The fast finale is dominated by fugal writing, a style in which Bach excelled above all other composers. The Church Cantata. In 1723, Bach moved yet again, this time to assume the coveted position of cantor of St. Thomas's Church and Choir School in Leipzig, Germany, a post he retained until his death in 1750. He seems to have been attracted to Leipzig, then a city of about 30,000 inhabitants, because of its excellent university where his sons might enroll at no cost. Although prestigious, the post of cantor of the Lutheran Church of St. Thomas was not an easy one. As an employee of the town council of Leipzig, Bach was charged with superintending the liturgical music of the 4 principal churches of that city. He also played organ for all funerals, composed any music needed for ceremonies at the university, and sometimes taught Latin grammar to the boys at the choir school of St. Thomas. But by far the most demanding part of his job as cantor was to provide new music for the church each Sunday and religious holiday, a total of about 60 days a year. In so doing, Bach brought an important genre of music, the church cantata, to the highest point of its development. Like the opera, the sonata, and the concerto, the cantata first appeared in Italy during the 17th century in the form we call the chamber cantata. Typically written for a solo singer and small accompanying orchestra, the chamber cantata treated subjects of love or history and was performed in the home. During the early 18th century, however, composers in Germany increasingly came to see the cantata as an appropriate vehicle for religious music in the church. Bach and his contemporaries created the church cantata, a multi-movement sacred work including arias, ariosos, and recitatives, performed by vocal soloists, a chorus, and a small accompanying orchestra. The church cantata became the musical core of the Sunday service of the Lutheran Church, the Protestant religion that then dominated spiritual life in German-speaking lands. Figure 13, 6. Leipzig, St. Thomas's Church and Choir School from an engraving of 1723, the year in which Bach moved to the city. Bach's large family occupied 900 square feet of the second floor of the choir school. Copyright Bettmann Corbis. In Bach's time, St. Thomas's Church in Leipzig celebrated a Sunday Mass, as prescribed by Martin Luther nearly 2 centuries earlier. The service began at 7 o'clock in the morning and lasted nearly 4 hours. The musical high point, the cantata, came after the reading of the Gospel and provided a commentary on the Gospel text, allowing the congregation to meditate on the word of the Lord. The preacher then delivered an hour-long sermon, which also expounded on the scriptural theme of the day. Bach wrote almost 300 cantatas for the citizens of Leipzig, though only about 200 of these survive. His musical forces consisted of about a dozen men and boy singers from the St. Thomas Choir School and an equal number of instrumentalists from the university and town. The ensemble was placed in a choir loft above the west door, and Bach himself conducted the group, beating time with a roll of paper. Figure 13, 7. Looking across the parishioners' pews and toward the high altar at St. Thomas's Church, Leipzig, as it was in the mid-19th century. The pulpit for the sermon is at the right. In Bach's day, nearly 2,500 people would crowd into the church. Lebrecht Music and Arts. Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme. Bach was a devoted husband, a loving father to 20 children in all, and a respected burgher of Leipzig. Yet above all, he was a religious man who composed not only for self-expression but also for the greater glory of God. His cantata Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme reveals his abiding faith in the religious traditions of his German Lutheran community. Bach composed it in 1731 for a service on a Sunday immediately before the beginning of Advent. The text of the cantata announces the coming of a bridegroom toward his hopeful bride. Christ is the groom. A group of 10 virgins, whose story is recounted in the Gospel of Matthew, symbolizes the bride and the entire community. Here is the Gospel of Matthew as it was read to the congregation at St. Thomas's Church immediately before Bach's cantata was performed. Download supplementary listening guides for Bach, cantatas Christlag in Todsbanden and Ein Festberg, as well as the chorale prelude Christlag in Todsbanden, at the text website. Then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins, which took their lamps, and went forth to meet the bridegroom. And 5 of them were wise, and 5 were foolish. They that were foolish took their lamps, but took no oil with them. And at midnight there was a cry made, Behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out to meet him. Then all those virgins arose, and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said unto the wise, Give us of your oil, for our lamps are gone out. But the wise answered, saying, Not so, lest there be not enough for us and you, but go ye rather to them that sell, and buy for yourselves. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and they that were ready went in with him to the marriage, and the door was shut. Watch therefore, for ye know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh. The message to every good Lutheran of Leipzig was clear: get your spiritual house in order so as to receive the coming Christ. Thus Bach's cantatas were intended not as concert pieces but as religious instruction for his community, sermons in music. The cantata Wachet auf is made up of a succession of 7 independent movements. Those for chorus provide a structural framework, coming at the beginning, the middle, and the end. They make use of the 3 stanzas of text of a 16th-century Lutheran hymn, Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme, from which this cantata derives its name. The text of the recitatives and arias, on the other hand, is a patchwork of biblical quotations cobbled together by a contemporary of Bach's. Thus the chorus sings the verses of the traditional hymn, while the soloists present the biblical excerpts in the recitatives and arias. Notice how the structure of the cantata creates a formal symmetry. Recitative, aria pairs surround the central choral movement, and are preceded and followed in turn by a chorus. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 16, Baroque Music, the vocal music of Johann Sebastian Bach, at the text website. Wachet auf is built upon a chorale, a spiritual melody or religious folk song of the Lutheran Church, what other denominations would simply call a hymn. Most chorale tunes were centuries old by Bach's time and belonged to the religious tradition of the community. Most Lutherans knew these melodies by heart. Chorales are easy to sing because they have clear-cut phrases and a steady beat with 1 syllable of text per note. The structure of the chorale tune Wachet auf is typical of this genre. The music unfolds in AAB form, and the 7 musical phrases are allocated in the following way: AAB. The last phrase of section A returns at the end of B to round out the melody. Movement 1. Of the 7 movements of the cantata Wachet auf, the most remarkable is the first, a gigantic chorale fantasy that displays a polyphonic mastery exceptional even for Bach. Here Bach creates a multidimensional spectacle surrounding the coming of Christ. First, the orchestra announces Christ's arrival by means of a 3-part ritornello that conveys a sense of growing anticipation. Part of the ritornello, with its dotted rhythm, suggests a steady march. Part B, with its strong downbeat and then syncopations, imparts a tugging urgency. Part C, with its rapid 16th notes, implies an unrestrained race toward the object of desire. Now the chorale melody enters high in the sopranos, the voice of tradition, perhaps the voice of God. In long, steady notes placed squarely on downbeats, it calls the people to prepare themselves to receive God's Son. Beneath this the voices of the people, the altos, tenors, and basses, scurry in rapid counterpoint, excited by the call to meet their Savior. Lowest of all is the bass of the basso continuo. It plods along, sometimes in a dotted pattern, sometimes in rapid 8th notes, but mostly in regularly recurring quarter notes falling on the beat. The enormous complexity of a movement such as this shows why musicians, then and now, view Bach as the greatest contrapuntist who ever lived. What did Mrs. Bach do? Actually, there were 2 Mrs. Bachs. The first, Maria Barbara, died suddenly in 1720, leaving the composer with 4 young children. The second, Anna Magdalena, he married in 1722, and she would bear him 13 more. Anna Magdalena Bach was a professional singer, earning about as much as her new husband at the court of Cöthen. But when the family moved to Leipzig and the St. Thomas Church, Anna Magdalena curtailed her professional activities. Women did not perform publicly in the Lutheran Church at this time. The difficult soprano lines in Bach's religious works were sung by choir boys. Consequently, Anna Magdalena put her musical skills to work as manager of what might be called Bach Incorporated. For almost every Sunday throughout the year, J.S. Bach was required to produce a cantata, about 20 to 25 minutes of new music, week after week, year after year. Writing the music was only part of the high-pressure task. Rehearsals had to be set and music learned by the next Sunday. But composing and rehearsing paled in comparison to the amount of time needed to copy all the parts. These were the days before photocopy machines and software programs to notate music. Each of the approximately 12 independent lines of the full score had to be copied, entirely by hand, for each new cantata, along with sufficient copies for all the singers and players. For this, Bach turned to the members of his household, namely, his wife and children, as well as the nephews, and other fee-paying private students who resided in the cantor's quarters at the St. Thomas School. In 1731, the year he composed the cantata Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme, the roof was taken off the building and 2 more stories added to accommodate the Bach family and its music industry. When Bach died in 1750, he left his most valuable assets to his eldest sons. The performing parts to many of his cantatas, however, he left to his wife with the expectation that she would rent or sell them in the course of time, her old age pension in the days before Social Security. In the end, however, the income from these cantata manuscripts did not prove sufficient, and Anna Magdalena Bach finished her days in 1760 as a ward of the city of Leipzig. Movement 2. In this recitative, the evangelist invites the daughters of Zion to the wedding feast. There is no use of chorale tune. In Bach's religious vocal music, the evangelist is invariably sung by a tenor. Movement 3. In this aria between the soul and Jesus, there is also no use of chorale tune. It is traditional in German sacred music of the Baroque era to assign the role of Christ to a bass. Movement 4. For this meeting of Christ and the daughters of Zion, Bach fashioned one of his loveliest creations. Again the chorale tune serves as a unifying force, now carrying stanza 2 of the chorale text. Once more Bach constructs a musical tapestry for chorus and orchestra, but a less complex one than the first movement. Here we hear only two central motives. One is the chorale melody sung by the tenors, who represent the watchmen calling on Jerusalem to awake. The other is the exquisite melody played by all the violins and violas in unison. Their togetherness symbolizes the unifying love of Christ for his people. This unison line is a perfect example of a lengthy, ever-expanding Baroque melody, and one of the most memorable of the entire era. Beneath it we hear the measured tread of the ever-present basso continuo. The bass plays regularly recurring quarter notes on the beat. As we have seen, a bass that moves at a moderate, steady pace, mostly in equal note values and often stepwise up or down the scale, is called a walking bass. The walking bass in this movement enhances the meaning of the text, underscoring the steady approach of the Lord. This movement was one of Bach's own favorites and the only cantata movement that he published. All the rest of his Leipzig cantata music was left in handwritten scores at the time of his death. Listening Exercise 20. Bach. Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme. 21112. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. The most famous section of Bach's cantata Wachet auf is in the middle movement. Here the composer creates for the strings a lovely melody to be used as a counterpoint to the chorale tune. Let us begin by considering the string melody and its accompaniment, and then the chorale. 1. How many musical lines or parts do you hear at the beginning of the movement? A. 1B, 2C, 3. 2. A bass that plods along in equal note values moving in predominantly stepwise motion is called what? A. Basso continuo. B. A basso ostinato. C. A walking bass. 3. The basses play only quarter notes on the beat until they begin to move more quickly in eighth notes. Where does the change to eighth notes begin? A. 010. B. 018. C. 026. D. 034. 4. When the chorale tune enters, how is it sung? A. In unison by the sopranos. B. In unison by the tenors. C. In four-part harmony. 5. Bach sets the chorale tune in notes that are which? A. Longer than those of the strings. B. Shorter than those of the strings. 6. Throughout this section, which is true? A. The chorale tune is in the middle of the texture, strings at the top, and double basses and cellos at the bottom. B. The chorale tune is at the top of the texture, strings in the middle, and double basses and cellos at the bottom. 7. Do the relative positions of the string melody and the chorale tune change during this repeat? A. Yes. B. No. 8. Which is true about the nature of the string melody during the B section? A. It is an entirely new melody. B. Sometimes it repeats phrases from the A section. 9. At any time throughout this movement, is the three-line texture augmented by the addition of woodwinds and brasses? A. Yes. Bach adds these instruments to create a grand climax. B. No. Once Bach decides upon his three-strand texture, he maintains it rigorously to the end. 10. Why do you suppose this piece remains one of the most famous works in the repertoire of classical music? A. The lilting string melody has clear-cut phrases yet continually presses forward. B. The strong bass and lyrical melody provide a rock-solid framework. C. Bach ingeniously combines this beautiful melody with a pre-existing chorale tune. D. All of the above. Movement 5. In this recitative for Christ, there is no use of chorale tune. Christ invites the anguished soul to find comfort in him. Movement 6. In this aria for bass and soprano, again there is no use of chorale tune. The form is ternary, which for an aria is often called da capo form because the performers, when reaching the end of B, take it from the head, and repeat A. Here Christ and the soul sing a passionate love duet. A religious man who did not compose operas, Bach most closely approaches the world of the popular theater in this ardent duet. Movement 7. Bach's cantatas usually end with a simple four-voice homophonic setting of the last stanza of the chorale tune. In his closing movements, he always places the chorale melody in the soprano part, harmonizing and supporting it with the other three voices below. The instruments of the orchestra have no line of their own and merely double the four vocal parts. But more important, the members of the congregation join in the singing of the chorale melody. Martin Luther had ordained that the community should not merely witness but also participate in communal worship. At this moment, all of the spiritual energy of Leipzig was concentrated into this one emphatic declaration of faith. The coming Christ reveals to all true believers a vision of life in the celestial kingdom. Download a supplementary listening guide for Bach, Prelude and Fugue in C minor, from the Well-Tempered Clavier, at the text website. Figure 13:8. When Bach died in 1750, he was buried in an outlying parish church, and he and his music soon forgotten. But during the 19th century the world came to realize that the citizens of Leipzig had in their midst a musical genius. So in 1895 they dug him up to measure his skull to see if it were abnormally large or small, photographed his remains, and repositioned them beneath the high altar of his St. Thomas Church. Sometimes genius is recognized only belatedly. Gesamtanzig de Bach-Skeletts in W. His Anatomische Forschungen über Johann Sebastian Bachs Gebeine und Antlitz S. Leipzig, S. Herzl, 1895. In the last decade of his life, Bach gradually withdrew from the world to dwell in the contrapuntal realm of his own mind. He finished the best known of his large-scale contrapuntal projects, the Well-Tempered Clavier, a clavier simply being a general term for keyboard instruments. The Well-Tempered Clavier consists of two sets of 24 preludes and fugues. The prelude is a short preparatory piece that sets a mood and serves as a technical warm-up for the player before the fugue. In both sets of 24, there is one prelude and fugue in each of the 12 major and 12 minor keys. Today every serious pianist around the world cuts his or her teeth on what is affectionately known as the WTC. Bach's last project was The Art of Fugue, an encyclopedic treatment of all known contrapuntal procedures set forth in 19 canons and fugues. The final fugue, one in which Bach combines four related subjects, was broken off by his death in 1750. The Art of Fugue was thus Bach's valedictory statement of a musical form he brought to supreme mastery. It remains a fitting testimony to this composer's stylistic integrity, grand vision, and superhuman craftsmanship. Download a supplementary listening guide for Bach, Contrapunctus 5, from The Art of Fugue, at the text website. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lectures at Open Yale courses and complete this chapter's listening exercises interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words. Subject exposition episode Fugue pedal point cadenza church cantata chorale da capo form prelude The Art of Fugue. The late Baroque Handel 14. Bach and Handel were born in the same year, 1685, in small towns in central Germany. Other than that commonality, however, their careers could not have been more different. While Bach spent his life confined to towns in the region of his birth, the cosmopolitan Handel traveled the world, from Rome to Venice, to Hamburg, to Amsterdam, to London, to Dublin. If Bach was most at home playing organ fugues and conducting church cantatas from the choir loft, Handel was a musical entrepreneur working in the theater, by training and temperament a composer of opera. And if Bach fell into obscurity at the end of his life, retreating into a world of esoteric counterpoint, Handel's stature only grew larger on the international stage. He became during his lifetime the most famous composer in Europe and a treasured national institution in England. George Friedrich Handel. George Friedrich Handel was born in the town of Halle, Germany, in 1685, and died in London in 1759. Although his father had decreed a program of study in law, the young Handel managed to cultivate his intense interest in music, sometimes secretly in the attic. At the age of 18, he left for the city of Hamburg, where he took a job as second violinist in the public opera. But because the musical world around 1700 was dominated by things Italian, he set off for Italy to learn his trade and broaden his horizons. He moved between Florence and Venice, where he wrote operas, and Rome, where he composed mainly chamber cantatas. In 1710, Handel returned to North Germany to accept the post of chapel master to the Elector of Hanover, but on the condition that he be given an immediate leave of absence to visit London. Although he made one final voyage back to his employer in Hanover in 1711 and many subsequent visits to the continent, Handel conveniently forgot about his obligation to the Hanoverian court. London became the site of his musical activity and the place where he won fame and fortune. London in the early 18th century was the largest city in Europe, boasting a population of 500,000. It was also the capital city of a country in the process of forming an empire for international trade and commerce. London may not have possessed the rich cultural heritage of Rome or Paris, but it offered opportunity for financial gain. As the 18th century saying went, in France and Italy there is something to learn, but in London there is something to earn. Figure 14:1. Thomas Hudson's portrait of Handel with the score of Messiah visible in the composer's left hand. Handel had a quick temper, could swear in 4 languages, and liked to eat. Lebrecht Music and Arts. Handel soon found employment in the homes of the aristocracy and became the music tutor to the English royal family. As fate would have it, his continental employer, the Elector of Hanover, became King George I of England in 1714, when the Hanoverians acceded to the throne on the extinction of the Stuart line. Fortunately for Handel, the new king bore his truant musician no grudge, and he was called on frequently to compose festival music to entertain the court or mark its progress. For these events, Handel produced such works as Water Music, music for the royal fireworks, and the coronation service for King George II and Queen Caroline, parts of which have been used at the coronation of every English monarch since then. Handel and the Orchestral Dance Suite. The English royal family, which has historically had a problem with its image, has sometimes given concerts of popular music to win favor with the public. Queen Elizabeth II did so in 2002 by inviting Ozzy Osbourne and Paul McCartney to play at Buckingham Palace with simulcasts around the parks of London. Handel's Water Music was created for an earlier bit of royal image building. In 1717, King George I, a direct ancestor of the present Queen, was an unpopular monarch. He refused to speak a word of English, preferring his native German. He fought with his son, the Prince of Wales, even banning him from court. His subjects considered George dim-witted, an honest blockhead, as one contemporary put it. To improve his standing in the eyes of his subjects, the king's ministers planned a program of public entertainments, including an evening of music on the Thames River for the Lords of Parliament and the lesser people of London. Thus, on July 17, 1717, the king and his court left London, accompanied by a small armada of boats, and progressed up the Thames to the strains of Handel's orchestral music. An eyewitness describes this nautical parade in detail. About 8 in the evening the king repaired to his barge, into which were admitted the Duchess of Bolton, Countess Godolphin, Madame de Kilmansegg, Mrs. Were and the Earl of Orkney, the gentlemen of the bedchamber in waiting. Next to the king's barge was that of the musicians, about 50 in number, who played on all kinds of instruments, to wit trumpets, horns, hautboys, bassoons, German flutes, French flutes, violins and basses, but there were no singers. The music had been composed specially by the famous Handel, a native of Halle, and His Majesty's principal court composer. His Majesty so greatly approved of the music that he caused it to be repeated 3 times in all, although each performance lasted an hour, namely twice before and once after supper. The evening weather was all that could be desired for the festivity, the number of barges and above all of boats filled with people desirous of hearing the music was beyond counting. Figure 14:2. View of London, St. Paul's Cathedral, and the Thames River by Canaletto. Notice the large barges. Crafts such as these could have easily accommodated the 50 musicians reported to have played behind the king as he moved upstream in 1717, listening to Handel's Water Music. Bridgman Girardin Art Resource, New York. The score played for King George and the crowd of music lovers moving on the Thames River was, of course, Handel's Water Music. Water music belongs to a genre called the dance suite, a collection of dances, usually from 2 to 7 in number, all in one key and for one group of instruments, be it full orchestra, trio, or solo. Listeners usually did not dance to the music of a suite, these were stylized, abstract dances intended only for the ear. But it was the job of the composer to bring each one to life, to make it recognizable to the audience by incorporating the salient elements of rhythm and style of each particular dance. Among the dances found in a typical late Baroque suite are the allemande, the sarabande, and the minuet. Almost all dances of the Baroque period were composed in one musical form, binary form, the two sections of which could be repeated. Some dance movements are followed by a second, complementary dance, called a trio because it was originally played by only 3 instruments. When a minuet, for example, is followed by a trio and the minuet repeated, a large-scale ternary arrangement results, ap-dab. What make the dance movements of water music so enjoyable and easy to follow are their tuneful themes and formal clarity. Notice in the minuet and trio how Handel asks the French horns and trumpets first to announce both the A and B sections before passing this material on to the woodwinds and then the full orchestra. Here instrumentation makes the form clearly audible. Handel and opera. George Friedrich Handel emigrated from Germany to England in 1710 not for the chance to entertain the king, and certainly not for the cuisine or the climate. Rather, he went to London to make money producing Italian opera. With the rare exception of a work such as Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, there was no opera in London at this time. English audiences preferred spoken plays, with an occasional musical interlude. Handel aimed to change this. London audiences, he reasoned, were daily growing wealthier and more cosmopolitan, and would welcome the high art form provided by Italian opera. Guaranteeing himself a healthy share of the profits, Handel participated in the formation of an opera company, the Royal Academy of Music. He composed the music, engaged high-paid soloists from Italy, led the rehearsals, and conducted the finished product from the harpsichord in the orchestra pit. His first opera, Rinaldo, was first performed at the Queen's Theatre, the same theatre in which Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera premiered in 1986. Download a supplementary listening guide for Handel, Arias, La Giustizia, and The Doro Pupil from Giulio Cesare at the text website. The type of Italian opera Handel produced in London is called opera seria, a style that then dominated the operatic stage throughout continental Europe. Glorifying the nobility, opera seria chronicles the triumphs and tragedies of kings and queens, gods and goddesses. Much of the action occurs off stage and is simply reported in the form of recitatives. The principal characters react to these unseen events by means of arias that express stock emotions, hope, anger, hate, frenzy, and despair, to name a few. In Handel's day, the leading male roles were sung by castrati. Baroque audiences associated high social standing on stage with a high voice, male or female. From 1710 until 1728, Handel had great artistic and some financial success, producing 24 examples of Italian opera seria. Foremost among these was Giulio Cesare, a recasting of the story of Caesar's conquest of the army of Egypt and Cleopatra's romantic conquest of Caesar. But opera is a notoriously risky business, and in 1728, Handel's Royal Academy of Music went bankrupt, a victim of the exorbitant fees paid the star singers and the fickle tastes of English theatergoers. Handel continued to write operas into the early 1740s, but he increasingly turned his attention to a musical genre similar in construction to opera, oratorio. Handel and oratorio. An oratorio is literally something sung in an oratory being a hall or chapel used specifically for prayer and sometimes prayer with music. Thus the oratorio in 17th century Italy had something in common with today's gospel music. It was sacred music sung in a special hall or chapel and was intended to inspire the faithful to greater devotion. By the time it reached Handel's hands, however, the oratorio had become close to an unstaged opera with a religious subject. Both Baroque oratorio and opera begin with an overture, are divided into acts, and are composed primarily of recitatives and arias. Both genres are also long, usually lasting 2 to 3 hours. But there are a few important differences between opera and oratorio, aside from the obvious fact that oratorio treats a religious subject. Oratorio, being a quasi-religious genre, is performed in a church, a theater, or a concert hall, but it makes no use of acting, staging, or costumes. Because the subject matter is almost always sacred, there is more of an opportunity for moralizing, a dramatic function best performed by a chorus. Thus the chorus assumes greater importance in an oratorio. It sometimes serves as a narrator but more often functions, like the chorus in ancient Greek drama, as the voice of the people commenting on the action that has transpired. Figure 14.3. Title page of an early English edition of Handel's opera Julius Caesar. The musicians form a basso continuo. Lebrecht Music and Arts. By the 1730s, oratorio appeared to Handel as an attractive alternative to the increasingly unprofitable opera in London. He could do away with the irascible and expensive castrati and prima donnas. He no longer had to pay for elaborate sets and costumes. He could draw on the ancient English love of choral music, a tradition that extended well back into the Middle Ages. And he could exploit a new, untapped market, the faithful of the Puritan, Methodist, and growing evangelical sects in England, who had viewed the pleasures of foreign opera with distrust and even contempt. And in contrast to the Italian opera, the oratorio was sung in English, contributing further to the appeal of the genre to a large segment of English society. Messiah. Beginning in 1732 and continuing over a 20-year period, Handel wrote upward of 20 oratorios. The most famous of these is his Messiah, composed in the astonishingly short period of 3.5 weeks during the summer of 1741. It was first performed in Dublin, Ireland, the following April as part of a charity benefit, with Handel conducting. Having heard the dress rehearsal, the local press waxed enthusiastic about the new oratorio, saying that it far surpasses anything of that nature which has been performed in this or any other kingdom. Such a large crowd was expected for the work of the famous Handel that ladies were urged not to wear hoopskirts and gentlemen were admonished to leave their swords at home. In this way, an audience of 700 could be squeezed into a hall of only 600 seats. Buoyed by his artistic and financial success in Dublin, Handel took Messiah back to London, made minor alterations, and performed it in Covent Garden Theatre. In 1750, he offered Messiah again, this time in the chapel of the Foundling Hospital, an orphanage in London, and again there was much popular acclaim for Handel, as well as profit for charity. This was the first time one of his oratorios was sung in a religious setting rather than a theatre or a concert hall. The annual repetition of Messiah in the Foundling Hospital chapel during Handel's lifetime and long after did much to convince the public that his oratorios were essentially religious music to be performed in church. In a general way, Messiah tells the story of the life of Christ. It is divided into 3 parts. The prophecy of his coming and his incarnation, his passion and resurrection, and the triumph of the gospel, and reflections on the Christian victory over death. Most of Handel's oratorios recount the heroic deeds of characters from the Old Testament. Messiah is exceptional because the subject comes from the New Testament, though much of the libretto is drawn directly from both the Old and New Testaments. There is neither plot action nor characters in the dramatic sense. The music consists of 53 numbers, 19 choruses, 16 solo arias, 16 recitatives, and 2 purely instrumental pieces. Figure 14.4. The Chapel of the Foundling Hospital, London, where Messiah was performed annually for the benefit of the orphans. Handel himself designed and donated the organ seen on the 2nd story at the back of the hall. The Art Archive, Eileen Tweedy. There are many beautiful and stirring arias in Messiah, including Every Valley Shall Be Exalted, and O Thou That Tellest Good Tidings to Zion. But perhaps the loveliest of all is the pastoral aria, He Shall Feed His Flock, which comes at the end of Part 1 and alludes to the birth of Christ. A pastoral aria has several distinctive characteristics, all of which suggest the movement of simple shepherds attending the Christ child. It glides along mainly in stepwise motion. It projects a lilting rhythm in which a slow-moving beat is subdivided into 3 easily flowing eighth notes. And it grounds itself upon a harmony that changes slowly. Even the key of F major is suggestive, for F major was traditionally heard as a relaxed tonality, and composers from Bach to Beethoven and beyond employed its particular sound to evoke shepherds and pastoral scenes. But let's not kill a beautiful melody with too much analysis and history. Just listen to what is arguably the most relaxing aria ever written, an anthem for peace. Download supplementary listening guides for more parts of Messiah, French Overture, Recitative, Comfort Ye My People, Aria, Every Valley Shall Be Exalted, and Chorus, and the Glory of the Lord, at the text website. Despite the beauty of the arias, the true glory of Messiah is to be found in its choruses. Handel is arguably the finest composer for chorus who ever lived. As a world traveler with an unsurpassed ear, he absorbed a variety of musical styles from throughout Europe. In Germany, he acquired knowledge of the fugue and the Lutheran chorale. In Italy, he immersed himself in the styles of the oratorio and the chamber cantata, and during his years in England, he became familiar with the idioms of the English church anthem. Most important, having spent a lifetime in the opera theater, Handel had a flair for the dramatic. Nowhere is Handel's choral mastery more evident than in the justly famous Hallelujah chorus that concludes Part 2 of Messiah. We have moved from peaceful adoration to triumphant resurrection, and now a variety of choral styles are displayed in quick succession: chordal, unison, chorale, fugale, and fugal and chordal together. The opening word Hallelujah recurs throughout as a powerful refrain, yet each new phrase of text generates its own distinct musical idea. The vivid phrases speak directly to the listener, making the audience feel like a participant in the drama. So moved was King George II when he first heard the great opening chords, as the story goes, that he rose to his feet in admiration, thereby establishing the tradition of the audience standing for the Hallelujah chorus, for no one sat while the king stood. Indeed, this movement would serve well as a royal coronation march, though in Messiah, of course, it is Christ the King who is being crowned. Listening Exercise 21. Handel. Messiah, Hallelujah chorus. 20. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. As a man of the theater, Handel was the master of the dramatic gesture. Sometimes, as we shall see, he would even insert a thundering silence for special effect. This exercise asks you to hear the frequent changes of texture in the Hallelujah chorus. It is by means of striking textural changes that Handel creates the grand effects of this classical favorite. 1. In what kind of musical texture do the voices sing when they enter with Hallelujah? A. Monophonic. B. Homophonic. C. Polyphonic. 2. As the chorus sings in unison and the violins double their part, what kind of texture is created? A. Monophonic. B. Homophonic. C. Polyphonic. 3. Now we have a passage of imitative, contrapuntal writing in which a subject is presented in succession in the voices. In what order do the voices enter with this subject? A. Alto, male voices, soprano. B. Soprano, male voices, alto. C. Soprano, alto, male voices. 4. Again, Handel offers a passage of imitative writing with a new subject. In what order do the voices enter? A. Bass, tenor, soprano, alto. B. Bass, alto, tenor, soprano. C. Bass, tenor, alto, soprano. D. Bass, soprano, alto, tenor. 5. Polyphonic passages such as this most closely approximate the style and musical texture found where? A. In a Gregorian chant. B. In a chorale tune. C. In a fugue. 6. What are the sopranos doing here on King of Kings and Lord of Lords? A. Rising in an arpeggio. B. Rising by leap. C. Rising by step. 7. What brass instruments, associated with kings through history, sound forth here along with King of Kings? A. Trombones. B. Trumpets. C. Tubas. 8. In a brilliant stroke, Handel sets off and highlights the final statement of Hallelujah by inserting a new kind of texture. Which is correct? A. He inserts a homophonic brass fanfare. B. He inserts the texture of silence. 9. Which correctly identifies the ways in which our modern recording of the Hallelujah chorus differs from the performance practices of Handel's time? A. An orchestra has been added to support what was only a chorus in Handel's original. B. The chorus is much larger, and women sing the alto and soprano chorus parts. C. Castrati would have been used in Handel's original chorus. 10. What perhaps accounts for the eternal popularity of the Hallelujah chorus? A. Handel draws upon a deep wellspring of English national pride, skillfully manipulating a chorale tune to create a variety of exciting textures and styles. B. Handel exploits a clear, emphatic setting of the English text and a few powerful gestures to create a variety of exciting textures and styles. C. Both the above. The Hallelujah chorus is a strikingly effective work mainly because the large choral force creates a variety of exciting textures. In fact, however, Handel's chorus for the original Dublin Messiah was much smaller than those used today. It included about 4 singers on the alto, tenor, and bass parts and 6 choir boys singing the soprano. The orchestra was equally slight. For the Foundling Hospital performances of the 1750s, however, the orchestra grew to 35 players. Then, over the next 100 years, the chorus progressively swelled to as many as 4,000 with a balancing orchestra of 500 in what were billed as festivals of the people, in honor of Handel. Figure 14.5. 18th century London was a place of biting satire. Here, in William Hogarth's The Oratorio Singer, the chorus of an oratorio is the object of parody. But there is an element of truth here. The chorus for the first performance of Messiah, for example, numbered about 16 males, with choirboys taking the soprano part. Women, however, sang soprano and alto for the vocal solos. Lebrecht Music and Arts. And just as there was a continual increase in the performing forces for his Messiah, so too Handel's fortune and reputation grew. Toward the end of his life, he occupied a squire's house in the center of London, bought paintings, including a large and, indeed excellent, Rembrandt, and, on his death, left an enormous estate of nearly £20,000, as the newspapers of the day were quick to report. More than 3,000 persons attended his funeral in Westminster Abbey on April 20, 1759, and a sculpture of the composer holding an aria from Messiah was erected above his grave and is still visible today. As a memento of Handel's music, Messiah was an apt choice, for it is still performed each year at Christmas and Easter by countless amateur and professional groups throughout the world. Figure 14.6. Handel's funeral monument at Westminster Abbey. The composer holds the aria, "I Know That My Redeemer Liveth," from Messiah. When Handel was buried, the gravedigger left room to cram in another body immediately adjacent. That space was later filled by the corpse of Charles Dickens. Copyright Joe and Harris Lebrecht Music and Arts. A complete checklist of musical style for the late Baroque can be found at the text website. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: Dance Suite Opera Seria Oratorio Pastoral Aria. Part 4. The Classical Period, 1750-1820. The Art Archive Johnny Dagli Ordi. 15 Classical Style. 16 Classical Composers, Haydn and Mozart. 17 Classical Forms, Ternary and Sonata Allegro. 18 Classical Forms, Theme and Variations, Rondo. 19 Classical Genres, Instrumental Music. 188 20 Classical Genres, Vocal Music. 21 Beethoven, Bridge to Romanticism. During the years 1750 to 1820, music manifested a style called classicism, often termed neoclassicism, in the other fine arts. In art and architecture, for example, neoclassicism aimed to reinstitute the aesthetic values of the ancient Greeks and Romans by incorporating balance and harmonious proportions while avoiding ornate decoration, all leading to a feeling of quiet grace and noble simplicity when expressed in music. These same tendencies appeared as balanced phrases, lucid textures, and clear, easily audible musical forms. Although composers in cities such as Milan, Paris, and London all wrote symphonies and sonatas with these qualities, the music of this period is often referred to as the Viennese classical style. Vienna, Austria, was the capital city of the Holy Roman Empire and the most active center of classical music in Central Europe. The three principal composers of the classical era, Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven, chose to make Vienna their home because of the city's vibrant musical life. In many ways, Mozart and Haydn created the classical style while Beethoven extended it. The majority of the works of Beethoven fall within the time frame of the classical era, but they also sometimes exhibit stylistic characteristics of the succeeding Romantic period. 15 Classical Style. Classical as a musical term has two separate, though related, meanings. We use the word classical to signify the serious or art music of the West as distinguished from folk music, popular music, jazz, and the traditional music of various ethnic cultures. We call this music classical because there is something about the excellence of its form and style that makes it enduring, just as a finely crafted watch or a vintage automobile may be said to be a classic because it has a timeless beauty. Yet in the same breath, we may refer to classical music, and by this we mean the music of a specific historical period, 1750, 1820, a period of the great works of Haydn and Mozart and the early masterpieces of Beethoven. The creations of these artists have become so identified in the public mind with musical proportion, balance, and formal correctness, with standards of musical excellence, that this comparatively brief period has given its name to all music of lasting aesthetic worth. Figures 15:1 and 15:2. The 2nd century Pantheon in Rome. The library of the University of Virginia, designed by Thomas Jefferson in the late 18th century. Jefferson had visited Rome and studied the ancient ruins while serving as ambassador to France. The portico, with columns and triangular pediment, and the central rotunda are all elements of classical style in architecture. Copyright Scala Ministero per I Beni e l'Attività Culturali Art Resource, New York. Joseph Sohm Visions of America Corbus. Classical derives from the Latin clas psychus, meaning something of the first rank or highest quality. To the men and women of the 18th century, no art, architecture, philosophy, or political institutions were more admirable, virtuous, and worthy of emulation than those of ancient Greece and Rome. Other periods in Western history also have been inspired by classical antiquity, the Renaissance heavily, the early Baroque less so, and the 20th century to some degree, but no period more than the 18th century this fascination with antiquity is evident, for example, in the enthusiasm surrounding the discovery of the ruins of Pompeii and the publication of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The 18th century was also the period during which young English aristocrats made the grand tour of Italy and carted back to their country estates Roman statues, columns, and parts of entire villas. Classical architecture, with its formal control of space, geometric shapes, balance, and symmetrical design, became the only style thought worthy for domestic and state buildings of consequence. European palaces, opera houses, theaters, and country homes all made use of it. Thomas Jefferson also traveled to Italy in these years while American ambassador to France, and later brought classical design to the United States. Our nation's capital, many state capitals, and countless other governmental and university buildings abound with the well-proportioned columns, porticos, and rotundas of the classical style. The Enlightenment. The classical era in music, art, and architecture coincides with the period in philosophy and letters known as the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, also referred to as the Age of Reason, thinkers gave free rein to the pursuit of truth and the discovery of natural laws. This is the era that saw the rise of a natural religion called deism, the belief that a creator made the world, set it in motion, and has left it alone ever since. This is also the age of such scientific advances as the discovery of electricity and the invention of the steam engine. The first Encyclopaedia Britannica appeared in 1771, and the French Encyclopaedia between 1751 and 1772, a 24-volume set whose authors discarded traditional religious convictions and superstitions in favor of more rational scientific, philosophical, and political beliefs. In France, the encyclopedists Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau espoused the principles of social justice, equality, religious tolerance, and freedom of speech. These Enlightenment ideals subsequently became fundamental to democratic government and were enshrined in the American Constitution. Needless to say, the notion that all persons are created equal and should enjoy full political freedom put the thinkers of the Enlightenment on a collision course with the defenders of the existing social order. The old political structure had been built on the superstitions of the church, the privileges of the nobility, and the divine right of kings. Voltaire attacked the habits and prerogatives of both clergy and aristocracy, and championed middle-class virtues, honesty, common sense, and hard work. The extravagant gestures and powdered wigs of the frivolous courtier were easy targets for his pen. A more natural appearance, one appropriate to a tradesman, merchant, or manufacturer, now became the paradigm. Spurred on by economic self-interest and the principles of the Enlightenment philosophers, an expanding, more confident middle class in France and America rebelled against the monarchy and its supporters. The American colonists issued a Declaration of Independence in 1776, and French citizens stormed the Bastille in 1789 to gain weapons, thereby precipitating a civil war among classes. The Age of Reason gave way to the Age of Revolution. Figure 15:3. Thomas Jefferson, by the French sculptor Houdon, done in 1789, the year of the French Revolution. Philip Mould Ltd., London The Bridgeman Art Library. Music and social change, comic opera. Music was affected by these profound social changes, and in some ways, it helped to precipitate them. A new form of opera, comic opera, proved to be a powerful vehicle for social reform. Opera in the Baroque period had been dominated by opera seria. It was beautiful, grandiose, somewhat stiff, and expensive to mount. Portraying the deeds of mythological gods and goddesses, and historical emperors and kings, it glorified the deeds of the aristocracy. By contrast, the new comic opera, called opera buffa in Italy, championed middle-class values. It made use of everyday characters and situations. It typically employed spoken dialogue and simple songs in place of recitatives and a capo arias, and it was liberally spiced with sight gags, slapstick antics, and bawdy humor. The librettos, such as they were, either poked fun at the nobility for its pomposity and incompetence or criticized it for being heartless. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 17, Mozart and His Operas, at the text website. Like seditious pamphlets, comic operas appeared across Europe. Among them were John Gay's The Beggar's Opera in England,